The clock showed 11:45 p.m. when Jack parked his worn-out car in front of the imposing gates of Whispering Pines Cemetery. The metallic creak echoed through the night as he opened the gate, making him shiver involuntarily. Shadows danced around, cast by the waning moon barely illuminating the winding path between the tombstones. Jack adjusted the collar of his newly acquired uniform, feeling the weight of the night gravedigger badge on his chest. Just a week ago, he was comfortably working the day shift at Oakwood Cemetery, but a series of unfortunate events led him to this new job. The unjust dismissal still gnawed at him, but he had no choice but to accept this night position at Whispering Pines. As he walked towards the caretaker's office, Jack couldn't help but notice how different the cemetery seemed at night. The angel statues, which during the day appeared serene and comforting, now had a sinister air, their expressions contorted into grotesque grimaces under the dim light. The rustling leaves sounded like muffled whispers, and Jack swore he could hear footsteps echoing behind him, even when he turned around and saw no one. The caretaker's office was an old stone building with a single dusty window emitting a yellowish glow. Jack knocked on the door, and the sound reverberated unnaturally. After a few moments of unsettling silence, the door opened with a chilling creak. "Ah, you must be the new guy," said a hoarse voice from the shadows. An elderly man emerged, his wrinkled face partially obscured by a gray, unkempt beard. His eyes, however, shone with a disturbing intensity. "I'm Mr. Graves, the head caretaker." Jack swallowed hard, trying to ignore the irony of the man's name. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Graves. I'm Jack, the new night gravedigger." Mr. Graves scrutinized him for a moment, his eyes narrowing. "Ever worked in a cemetery at night before, kid?" "Actually, no," Jack admitted, "but I have experience as a day gravedigger." An enigmatic smile formed on Mr. Graves's lips. "Oh, but night is a completely different world here at Whispering Pines. The shadows have a life of their own, you know." A shiver ran down Jack's spine, but he forced himself to smile. "I'm sure I'll get used to it quickly." Mr. Graves laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "We'll see, kid, we'll see." He handed Jack a set of keys and a map of the cemetery. "Your task is simple. Patrol the grounds, make sure no vandals get in, and, well, keep things in order." Jack nodded, eager to start his shift and prove himself. But as he turned to leave, Mr. Graves grabbed his arm with surprising strength for someone his age. "One last thing, Jack," he said, his voice low and grave. "No matter what you see or hear tonight, do not stray from the marked path on the map. And above all, do not enter the west section of the cemetery. Do you understand?" The intensity in Mr. Graves's gaze made Jack swallow hard again. "Yes, sir, I understand perfectly." With a final nod, Jack stepped out into the night, the map firmly clutched in his trembling hands. As he walked away from the office, the darkness seemed to swallow him, and the cemetery's nocturnal sounds grew louder. The distant howl of a dog, the melancholy hoot of an owl, and something else. Something Jack couldn't identify but made his hairs stand on end. Determined to do his job, Jack began his patrol. The path meandered between ancient graves and imposing mausoleums, some so old their names had been erased by time. With each step, Jack felt like invisible eyes were watching him, and more than once he turned around abruptly, convinced he had seen movement out of the corner of his eye. As he walked, Jack couldn't help but notice how the air grew colder in certain areas of the cemetery. At one point, he passed by a particularly ornate tomb and felt as if he had walked through a wall of ice. His breath came out in a vapor cloud, and for a moment, he swore he heard a whisper from the tomb. "Help me." Shaking his head to dispel such thoughts, Jack continued his patrol. But the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. The shadows seemed to move unnaturally, and the tree branches twisted like skeletal fingers trying to grab him. Then he heard it, a soft, almost inaudible crying coming from somewhere to his right. Jack hesitated, remembering Mr. Graves's warning not to stray from the marked path. But the sound was so distressed, so desperate, he couldn't simply ignore it. With his heart racing, Jack stepped off the path, following the sound of the crying. He moved between the tombstones, the blurred names passing by as he focused on the sound. As he got closer, the crying became clearer, and Jack could discern it was a young girl's voice. Finally, he reached a small clearing among the graves. There, sitting on a broken tombstone, was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 16, with long dark hair cascading like a curtain over her bowed face. Her white dress seemed to glow under the moonlight, creating a chilling contrast with the surrounding darkness. "Hello?" Jack called softly, not wanting to scare her. "Are you okay? You shouldn't be here at this hour." The girl slowly lifted her head, and Jack felt his blood run cold. Her eyes were a pale blue, so light they seemed almost white, and her skin had a deathly pallor. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but something was wrong with them. They seemed darker than normal tears. "You can see me?" she asked, her voice as soft as a summer breeze but laden with deep sadness. Jack took a hesitant step toward her. "Yes, I can. What's your name? What are you doing here?" The girl stood up gracefully, her movements too fluid to be natural. "My name is Emily," she replied. "And I don't know why I'm here. I'm lost." Something in Emily's voice made Jack want to help her despite the fear growing in his chest. "It's okay, Emily. I'll help you get out of here. Your parents must be worried." A sad smile formed on Emily's lips. "My parents? It's been so long since I've seen them." She took a step towards Jack, and he noticed with horror that her feet didn't touch the ground. "You're kind, Jack. Different from the others." Jack felt his heart race. How did she know his name? He didn't remember mentioning it. "Emily, what do you mean by different from the others?" Emily's smile widened, revealing teeth too sharp to be human. "The other gravediggers," she whispered. "They always run away. They never want to play." At that moment, the moon emerged fully from the clouds, bathing the clearing in its silver light. Jack looked down and saw with growing horror that Emily cast no shadow. And the tombstone she had been sitting on, it had Emily Johnson carved on it, along with the date of death 50 years ago. Jack felt his legs weaken, fear threatening to overwhelm him completely. He took a step back, ready to run, but Emily was suddenly right in front of him, her pale eyes fixed on his. "Please don't go," she pleaded, her voice echoing in a way that made Jack's bones shiver. "I'm so lonely here. Stay with me, Jack. Stay forever." Emily's cold hands reached out towards him, and Jack finally found his voice to scream. He turned and ran, stumbling among the tombstones, Emily's ghostly laughter echoing behind him. Branches seemed to reach out to grab him, and shadows danced at the edges of his vision. Jack ran until his lungs burned, until his legs threatened to give way. He didn't stop until he reached the lit path again, where he fell to his knees, panting and trembling. When he finally caught his breath and looked back, the clearing was empty. There was no sign of Emily or any disturbance. But Jack knew what he had seen, and he knew his first night at Whispering Pines was far from over. With trembling legs, Jack stood up, determined to complete his shift. But with every sound, every movement in the shadows, he wondered, would Emily return? And what else could be lurking in the depths of Whispering Pines Cemetery? The hours that followed were a test of endurance for Jack. Every shadow seemed to hold a dark secret. Every breeze carried unintelligible whispers. He forced himself to continue his patrol, clutching the map as if it were a talisman against the evil that seemed to permeate the air of Whispering Pines Cemetery. As the night wore on, Jack began to notice disturbing patterns. Certain tombstones seemed to change position when he wasn't looking directly at them. Wilted flowers on graves suddenly bloomed with unnatural vitality, only to crumble into ashes moments later. And worst of all, he kept hearing Emily's distant laughter, echoing among the graves like a sinister promise. It was around 3 a.m., the so-called Devil's Hour, when things really started to intensify. Jack was passing through a particularly old section of the cemetery when a sudden movement caught his attention. Turning sharply, he saw a hooded figure moving quickly among the tombs. "Hey!" Jack shouted, his voice trembling slightly. "Stop right there!" The figure paused for a moment, slowly turning to face him. Even from a distance, Jack could see there was no face under the hood, just an impenetrable darkness. Then, as fast as a blink of an eye, the figure vanished. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he ran to the spot where the figure had been. There were no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. But on the ground, glinting under the moonlight, was a small silver locket. With trembling hands, Jack picked up the object. It was surprisingly cold to the touch, as if it had been left in a freezer. Engraved on its surface was a strange symbol, a spiral intertwined with what seemed to be a crescent moon. As he examined the medallion, a sharp scream pierced the night air, making Jack jump. It came from the direction of the west section of the cemetery, the area Mr. Graves had expressly forbidden him to enter. For a moment, Jack hesitated. Part of him wanted to ignore the sound, follow instructions, and stay safe on the marked path. But another part, the part that had led him to follow Emily's cry earlier, urged him to investigate. With a deep sigh, Jack made his decision. Clutching the medallion in his hand, he headed for the west section, his steps echoing ominously in the silent night. As he approached the forbidden area, the atmosphere changed noticeably. The air grew denser, almost oppressive, and a thin mist began to form around his feet. The tombstones here were different, older, more elaborate, with strange symbols carved into their surfaces. Jack stopped in front of a large black marble mausoleum. The door was ajar, and a faint, pulsating glow came from within. With his heart in his throat, he approached and peered inside. The interior of the mausoleum was illuminated by black candles arranged in a circle on the stone floor. In the center of the circle, to Jack's horror, was Emily. She floated a few inches off the ground, her eyes closed and her arms outstretched. Around her, hooded figures identical to the one Jack had seen earlier moved in a slow, ritualistic dance. A deep, resonant voice began to chant in a language Jack didn't recognize. The words seemed to twist in the air, making his head ache and his vision blur. Emily began to glow with an ethereal light, her body trembling violently. Jack knew he should flee, that he should run and never look back. But something held him there, unable to move or look away. Then Emily opened her eyes. They were no longer the pale blue eyes Jack had seen before. Now they were completely black, like pools of infinite darkness, and they were fixed directly on him. "Jack," she said, her voice a bizarre mixture of plea and threat. "You came. Will you join us?" The hooded figures turned in unison, their faceless hoods directed at Jack. He could feel the weight of their invisible gazes, the hunger emanating from them. "No," Jack stammered, finally finding his voice. "This isn't real. This can't be real." Emily smiled, a smile that was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. "Oh, Jack, it's more real than you can imagine. This is the true purpose of Whispering Pines. It's not just a place for the dead to rest. It's a portal, a threshold between worlds. And you, my dear Jack, are the key we've been waiting for." The hooded figures began to move toward Jack, their movements fluid and inhuman. He tried to back away, but found his feet were firmly planted on the ground, as if they had grown roots. Then the medallion in his hand began to heat up. Jack raised it, and the symbol engraved on it shone with an intense light. The hooded figures recoiled, hissing in pain. Emily screamed, a sound that was part rage, part agony. "The symbol of the Guardians! How did you get it?" Jack had no idea what she was talking about, but he took advantage of the distraction to finally move. He turned and ran, running faster than he had ever run in his life. Behind him, he could hear Emily's furious screams and the sound of pursuit. Shadows stretched from the ground, trying to grab his ankles. Skeletal hands emerged from the graves, trying to stop him. But Jack kept running, the medallion clutched in his hand, shining like a beacon in the darkness. He didn't stop until he reached the caretaker's office, practically knocking down the door. Mr. Graves was there, sitting calmly as if he had been waiting for him. His eyes fixed on the medallion in Jack's hand, and a weary smile formed on his lips. "Ah, you found it. Well, I suppose it's time for some explanations, isn't it?" Jack, panting and trembling, could only nod. Mr. Graves sighed deeply. "Whispering Pines is not an ordinary cemetery, as you may have noticed. It's a place of ancient power, a focal point for energies most people don't even dream exist. And we, the caretakers and gravediggers, are more than mere employees. We are guardians, tasked with maintaining the balance between worlds." He gestured to the medallion. "That symbol is our protection, our weapon against the forces that try to break the veil between worlds." "Emily, Well, she is one of those forces. She was once human, yes, but now she is something more, something that yearns to escape the confines of death. Jack finally found his voice. But why me? Why hire me if it's so dangerous? Mr. Graves smiled sadly. We don't choose this path, Jack. It chooses us. You have a gift, a sensitivity to the supernatural that cannot be taught. That's why Emily was drawn to you. That's why the medallion responded to your touch. He stood up, placing a comforting hand on Jack's shoulder. I know it's a lot to absorb, and if you want to leave, no one will blame you. But if you decide to stay, if you decide to accept your role as a guardian, well, there's much more I need to teach you. Jack looked at the medallion in his hand, feeling its weight not just physically, but the weight of the responsibility it represented. Part of him wanted to flee, return to the safety of his normal life. But another part, a part he didn't know existed until that night, yearned for more. Yearned to understand, to protect, to make a difference in a battle most people didn't even know was being fought. With a deep breath, Jack raised his eyes to Mr. Graves. I'll stay, he said, his voice firm despite the fear still coursing through his veins. Teach me. Mr. Graves nodded, a glint of pride in his eyes. Very well, then. Your true journey in Whispering Pines begins now, Jack. And I must warn you, the nights will only get longer and darker from here on out. As the sun began to rise on the horizon, casting the first rays of light over the cemetery, Jack knew his life would never be the same. The world he knew had changed forever, and he along with it. The night had been long and full of terrors, but Jack knew, with a certainty that both scared and excited him, that it was only the beginning. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of knowledge and horror for Jack. Mr. Graves instructed him in the ancient rituals of the Guardians, teaching him to recognize the subtle changes in the air that indicated supernatural activity, to decipher the arcane symbols carved into the oldest tombstones, and to use the medallion to repel the most malevolent entities. Night after night, Jack patrolled Whispering Pines, his eyes now open to a world few could see. Restless ghosts, which he would have dismissed as tricks of the light before, now materialized before him, some pleading for help, others threatening with supernatural malice. Shadow creatures lurked at the edges of his vision, retreating only when he raised the shining medallion. And always, always there was Emily. She appeared at unexpected moments, sometimes as the scared girl he had first met, other times as the terrifying entity from the mausoleum. Her attempts to lure him to the side of darkness became more desperate and violent with each encounter. But Jack stood firm. With each challenge overcome, each entity banished back to its own realm, he felt his power and confidence grow. The fear that once dominated him gave way to a steely determination. It was on a particularly hectic night, almost 2 months after his first night in the cemetery, that everything changed. Jack was on his usual rounds when an agonizing scream cut through the air. It was not the ethereal scream of a ghost, but something decidedly human and full of pain. Running toward the sound, Jack found himself once again in the west section of the cemetery. There, lying on the ground in front of the black mausoleum, was Mr. Graves. Blood was oozing from a wound in his chest, and his eyes were wide with terror. "Jack," he gasped, extending a trembling hand. "Be careful. She is stronger than we thought." Before Jack could react, a familiar laugh echoed behind him. Turning, he saw Emily hovering in the air, her black eyes shining with a malevolent glee. "Oh, Jack," she sang, her voice a disturbing mix of childlike sweetness and ancient malice. "Did you really think you could stop me? That your little tricks and your shiny medallion would be enough?" With a gesture of her hand, the medallion around Jack's neck shattered, its fragments falling to the ground like silver tears. "No!" Jack cried, feeling the protective power dissipate. Emily laughed again, the sound reverberating through the cemetery with supernatural force. "You never really understood what was happening here, did you, Jack? Let me explain." With another gesture, the air around them trembled and distorted. Suddenly, Jack found himself surrounded by ethereal images, memories he realized, not just of Emily, but of dozens, hundreds of other people. "Whispering Pines is not just a portal," Emily explained, her voice now laden with the weight of ages. It's a prison built millennia ago to contain the most powerful and dangerous souls ever to walk the earth. And I am the warden. The images around them changed, showing Emily through the centuries, always young, always vigilant, always alone. The guardians, she continued, casting a look of contempt at the dying Mr. Graves, were created to help me, to keep the souls imprisoned here. But they forgot their true purpose. They became arrogant, thinking they could control me. Jack felt his world spin. Everything he thought he knew, everything he had learned in the past weeks, crumbled before this revelation. But you, Jack, Emily smiled, her dark eyes fixed on him with terrifying intensity. You are different. You have the potential to be more than just a guardian. You can be my equal, my partner in eternity. She extended her hand to him, her skin glowing with a supernatural light. Join me, Jack. Help me keep these souls trapped. Together, we can protect the world from the horrors they represent. Jack looked at Emily's outstretched hand, then at Mr. Graves lying on the ground. The old caretaker shook his head weakly, his last strength fading. Don't trust her, Mr. Graves whispered. She is the real threat. But his words were cut off as Emily made another gesture, and Mr. Graves's body dissolved into ashes. No more lies, Emily said, her voice now cold and relentless. It's time to make your choice, Jack. Join me and embrace your destiny, or join the souls I keep trapped here. Jack closed his eyes, his heart pounding in his chest. When he opened them again, there was a new determination in his gaze. I choose, he said slowly, neither option. Before Emily could react, Jack lunged forward, grabbing the broken fragments of the medallion. With a cry of pain and determination, he pressed them against his chest, feeling them sink into his flesh. An explosion of white light erupted from Jack, so intense that Emily recoiled, screaming. The very fabric of reality seemed to tear around them. What have you done? Emily screamed, her face a mask of horror and fury. Jack felt unimaginable power flow through him. He could see now, truly see, the true nature of Whispering Pines. It was not a prison nor a portal, it was a nexus, a convergence point for all souls, good and bad. I understand now, Jack said, his voice resonating with newfound power. It's not about trapping or releasing, it's about balance. With a gesture, he summoned the souls Emily had kept trapped for so long. They rose from their graves, not as malevolent entities, but as beings of pure energy. No! Emily screamed, trying to contain them, but it was too late. The souls circled around Jack and Emily, forming a vortex of light and shadow. Jack extended his hands, embracing the chaos and order, the light and the dark. This is the true purpose of Whispering Pines, Jack declared. Not to imprison, but to transcend, to find balance between life and death, between good and evil. Emily looked at him with a mix of fear and admiration. What have you become? She whispered. Jack smiled, a smile that contained the wisdom of ages. I have become what I was always destined to be, not a guardian, not a prisoner, but a mediator. With one final grand gesture, Jack released the power he had accumulated. A wave of energy swept through the cemetery, transforming it before their eyes. The dark tombstones gave way to monuments of shining crystal. The oppressive darkness was replaced by a soft, ethereal light. Emily, realizing her era of dominance had ended, let out one last scream before dissolving into thousands of points of light, joining the chorus of souls now floating freely through the cemetery. When the sun rose over Whispering Pines that morning, it did not illuminate a place of death and dark secrets, but a sanctuary of peace and transition. And at the center of it all was Jack, no longer just a simple night caretaker, but the guardian of the balance between worlds. Visitors to the cemetery in the days that followed noticed a subtle but profound change. A sense of peace and acceptance hung in the air, and if they paid close attention, they might see a young man with wise eyes walking among the graves, gently guiding souls on their final journey. Whispering Pines had transformed, and with it, the very concept of life after death. The terror of dark nights had given way to a new understanding of the eternal cycle of existence. But for those who knew the truth, who had witnessed the transformation, there remained a shiver of reverence and a constant reminder of the hidden power that exists at the boundaries between worlds. The waning moon barely illuminated Hollow Creek Cemetery when Thomas began his night shift. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and decomposition, an odor that, even after months on the job, still made his stomach churn. The tombstones cast misshapen shadows that seemed to writhe and move with the gentle breeze, as if the dead were restless in their graves. Thomas adjusted the collar of his jacket, trying to ward off the cold that seeped into his bones. It wasn't just the autumn chill that made him shiver. There was something about this place that constantly made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Following his usual routine, he began his rounds, the flashlight in his hand casting a trembling beam of light among the graves. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional hoot of a distant owl or the rustle of dry leaves underfoot. It was during his second pass around the cemetery's perimeter that Thomas noticed something different, a faint, almost imperceptible glow coming from the edge of the forest that surrounded the area. He stopped, squinting to see better. There, among the shadows of the trees, 2 points of light glowed like tiny embers. Thomas felt his heart race but tried to calm himself. "Probably just a deer," he murmured, his voice sounding oddly loud in the night silence. But as he watched, something about those eyes disturbed him deeply. They didn't blink, didn't move. They just watched. And there was something in that gaze, an intelligence, a malice that no animal should possess. Thomas forced himself to continue his rounds, but couldn't shake those eyes from his mind. Every few steps, he glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see the creature emerging from the shadows. But the eyes stayed where they were, unmoving, vigilant. The hours dragged on, and Thomas found himself avoiding the area near the forest. He tried to focus on his tasks, checking the mausoleum locks, ensuring no vandals had entered. But his mind kept drifting back to those glowing eyes. Around 3 in the morning, the darkest hour before dawn, things started to get truly unsettling. Thomas was on his final round when he heard a sound, a branch snapping in the forest. He turned sharply, his flashlight illuminating the edge of the trees. The eyes had moved. They were closer now, right at the tree line. And there weren't just 2 pairs anymore. Thomas counted 4, 6, 8 pairs of glowing eyes, all fixed on him with a predatory intensity that chilled his blood. "Who's there?" Thomas shouted, his voice trembling despite his efforts to sound authoritative. "This is private property. You're trespassing." There was no response, just the oppressive silence of the night. But the eyes didn't move, didn't blink. They just continued to watch him with that unnatural hunger. Thomas backed away slowly, his heart pounding so hard in his chest that he was sure whatever was in the forest could hear it. He didn't take his eyes off those glowing lights as he moved towards the caretaker's office. Once inside the small wooden building, Thomas locked the door behind him, his hands shaking so badly he could barely turn the key. He collapsed into the chair behind the desk, panting, sweat running down his face despite the cold. For several minutes, Thomas sat there trying to calm himself, trying to rationalize what he had seen. Maybe it was just teenagers playing a prank, or poachers, or... A scratching at the window made him jump. Thomas turned slowly, his body rigid with fear. There, on the other side of the dusty glass, were the eyes. Dozens of them now, glowing with a supernatural light. Pressed against the window as if trying to push through. Thomas stifled a scream, falling from his chair in his effort to back away. He crawled to the far corner of the office, his eyes fixed on the window, unable to look away from the horror. The eyes began to move, sliding across the glass as if they had a life of their own. They traced strange, almost hypnotic patterns. Thomas felt his mind start to blur, his vision dimming at the edges. Then he heard it, a whisper so faint he initially thought it was just the wind. But as he focused, the words began to take shape. "Thomas, Thomas, join us, Thomas. Come to the forest. We are waiting." The sound seemed to come from inside his own head, a cacophony of whispering voices that threatened to shatter his sanity. Thomas pressed his hands to his ears, squeezing his eyes shut, but the voices continued, louder, more insistent. "Stop," he screamed, his voice raw with terror. "Leave me alone!" As if responding to his shout, there was a sound of breaking glass. Thomas opened his eyes to see the window shattering, shards of glass raining down onto the office floor, and through the opening the shadows began to pour in. They weren't solid, but they weren't just darkness either. They were something in between, a black, oily substance that moved with a will of its own, and in each drop of that living darkness, a pair of glowing eyes stared back at him. Thomas tried to stand, tried to run, but his body wouldn't respond. He could only watch, paralyzed with terror, as the shadows flowed towards him, covering the office floor and climbing the walls. The voices in his head reached a deafening crescendo, a cacophony of whispers and screams that threatened to tear his mind apart. And then, as the first wave of that living darkness touched his foot, Thomas finally found his voice to scream. His scream echoed through the empty cemetery, a sound of pure terror that made even the dead in their graves stir uneasily. But there was no one to hear him, no one to help him. As the shadows engulfed him, the glowing eyes being the last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him completely, Thomas had one final coherent thought. He should never have taken this job. He should never have come to Hollow Creek. And then, the world vanished into a whirlpool of darkness and glowing eyes, leaving only the echo of his scream to fade into the night. Dawn found Thomas lying on the office floor, his body covered in scratches and bruises, his clothes torn and stained with a dark, viscous substance. He woke with a start, his heart racing, his eyes wide with panic. For a moment he was paralyzed, fearing the shadows and eyes were still there. But the office was empty, bathed in the weak light of the rising sun filtering through the broken window. The only sound was his own ragged breathing and the occasional caw of a distant crow. Trembling, Thomas got up, his muscles protesting with every movement. Every inch of his body ached, as if he had been beaten for hours. But it wasn't the physical pain that troubled him the most. It was the feeling of having been violated. As if something had invaded his mind, rifled through his most intimate thoughts, his most precious memories. Stumbling to the small mirror hanging on the wall, Thomas choked back a scream at the sight of his reflection. His face was waxy pale, marked with deep scratches that seemed to form strange patterns on his skin. But it was his eyes that shocked him the most. Where once there had been brown irises, there was now only a dull glow, as if a thin gray film had formed over them. "What did they do to me?" he whispered, his voice hoarse and trembling. With shaky legs, Thomas left the office, blinking against the light of the rising sun. The cemetery looked normal at first glance, silent tombstones, grass covered in dew. But there was something wrong. The shadows seemed deeper, more alive, and in every dark corner, every space between the tombstones, he swore he saw a fleeting glow, like the reflection of watching eyes. Determined to find some evidence of what had happened, Thomas forced himself to walk to the edge of the forest. With every step, he felt as if he were being watched by hundreds of invisible eyes. The air seemed denser there, laden with a putrid smell that made his stomach churn. Then he saw it. On the ground, where the cemetery grass met the forest's first trees, there were marks. Not footprints of animals or humans, but sinuous trails, as if something viscous had crawled in and out of the forest, and mixed with the damp earth were stains of that same dark substance covering his clothes. Thomas knelt, extending a trembling hand to touch one of the stains. The moment his fingers made contact, a sharp pain shot through his arm. Fragmented images flooded his mind, creatures writhing in the darkness, glowing eyes watching from all angles, voices whispering horrible secrets no mortal should know. He recoiled, falling backward onto the grass, panting and trembling. The visions continued to flash in his mind, each more disturbing than the last. And with them came a terrible certainty. Whatever those things in the forest were, they weren't done with him. This was just the beginning. In the days that followed, Thomas desperately tried to return to normal. He continued his job at the cemetery, determined not to let the terror of that night control him. But with each nightfall, his fear grew. The shadows seemed to move with a will of their own, and the silence of the night was broken by whispers he couldn't understand, but which chilled his blood. And the eyes were always there. Sometimes just a pair, glowing in the darkness of the forest. Other times, dozens of them, watching him from every dark corner of the cemetery. Thomas tried to ignore them, tried to convince himself it was just his imagination. But deep down, he knew they were real, and they were getting bolder. A week after the initial incident, Thomas was making his nightly rounds when he heard a sound that almost stopped his heart. Wet, slithering footsteps coming from the forest. He turned slowly, his flashlight trembling in his hand, and he saw it. A figure was emerging from the trees. It wasn't solid, but a writhing mass of shadows and glowing eyes. As it moved towards him, Thomas could see faces forming and dissolving on its surface, faces twisted in expressions of agony and ecstasy. "No," Thomas whispered, backing away. "No, please, not again." The creature stopped, its multiple mouths opening in grotesque smiles. And then, with a voice that was thousands of voices at once, it spoke. "Thomas, you are ours now, part of us. You cannot escape what you started." With a scream of terror, Thomas turned and ran. He ran like he had never run before, his lungs burning, his muscles screaming in protest. But he could hear the thing behind him, its slithering footsteps getting closer and closer. When he reached the cemetery gates, Thomas looked back one last time. The creature had stopped at the edge of the cemetery, its glowing eyes fixed on him. And in that moment, Thomas understood a terrible truth. He could leave the cemetery, but he would never truly be free. A part of him, no matter how small, now belonged to that thing. And one day, it would come to claim what was its. With tears in his eyes and his heart broken with fear, Thomas ran into the darkness of the night, leaving behind the Hollow Creek Cemetery and the horror that now called that place home. But as he ran, he couldn't shake the feeling that, no matter how far he went, those eyes would always find him in the shadows. The months that followed were an endless nightmare for Thomas. He fled from Hollow Creek, moving to a big city hundreds of miles away, hoping that urban anonymity might protect him. But every night, he woke up drenched in cold sweat, the echoes of dark whispers still reverberating in his mind. The scars on his body, those strange patterns left by the scratches of that fateful night, did not disappear. On the contrary, they seemed to deepen over time, the lines becoming darker and more defined. Thomas avoided looking at himself in the mirror, fearing what he might see reflected in his lifeless, vacant eyes. He tried to seek help. Doctors frowned at his inexplicable scars. Psychiatrists listened to his stories with barely concealed skepticism, prescribing antipsychotics that did nothing to silence the whispers or chase away the shadows dancing on the periphery of his vision. One night, about 6 months after his escape, Thomas was returning to his small apartment after a shift at the night job he had gotten at a local factory. The streets were deserted, lit only by the yellow glow of the streetlights. That was when he saw it. There, reflected in the window of a closed shop, was not his own reflection, but a writhing mass of shadows and glowing eyes. Thomas froze, his heart racing in his chest. Slowly, trembling, he turned. The street behind him was empty. But when he looked back at the window, the creature was still there, its countless eyes fixed on him with an insatiable hunger. "No," Thomas whispered, his voice broken by terror. "Please, no." As if responding to his plea, the creature in the window smiled, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. And then, with a fluid motion, it began to emerge from the glass. Thomas ran. His feet pounded on the asphalt as he sprinted through the empty streets, panic giving him a speed he never knew he possessed. But every time he passed by a window or a puddle, he could see the creature, always just behind him, always smiling that toothy grin. When he finally reached his apartment, Thomas locked the door with trembling hands, piling furniture against it in a futile effort to keep the horror outside. He curled up in a corner, his wide eyes fixed on the room's only window, waiting to see those glowing eyes appear at any moment. The hours dragged on. The darkness outside seemed denser, more alive. Shadows moved under the door crack, and Thomas could swear he heard the sound of something wet and slithering, creeping through the hallway outside. It was when the first ray of morning sunlight began to filter through the window that Thomas finally relaxed, exhausted and broken. He had survived the night, but he knew it was only a matter of time. The creature, whatever it was becoming stronger, bolder, and a part of him, the part that had been touched by the darkness that night in the cemetery, yearned for it. In the days that followed, Thomas rarely left his apartment. He covered all mirrors and reflective surfaces, boarded up the windows, and refused to answer the door no matter who knocked. But even so, he could feel it. The eyes were always there, watching, waiting. A week after the incident on the street, Thomas was sitting in his darkened room, his bloodshot eyes fixed on the wall, when he heard it. A whisper, so low he initially thought it was just his imagination. "Thomas, it's time to come home." He turned slowly, his body rigid with fear. There, emerging from the shadow cast by his own form, was the creature. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and its smile was even wider and more terrible than Thomas remembered. "There's nowhere to run, Thomas," the creature spoke, its voice a cacophony of whispers. "You are part of us now. You always have been." As the creature advanced, its shadows stretching out to engulf him, Thomas finally understood. It didn't matter where he ran or where he hid. The horror he encountered that night in the Hollow Creek Cemetery wasn't something external, something he could flee from. It was part of him now, as intrinsically linked to his soul as his own shadow. With a scream that was as much terror as it was a terrible acceptance, Thomas felt the shadows envelop him. His last conscious vision was of countless glowing eyes, watching him with an infinite hunger as he was pulled into the darkness. The next day, Thomas's neighbors, worried about his reclusion, called the police. When the officers broke down the door, they found the apartment empty. There was no sign of a struggle, no evidence of where Thomas might have gone. The only thing out of place was a broken mirror, its shards scattered across the floor like silver tears. And if someone looked closely, very closely, they might see, reflected in the fragments of the mirror, the fleeting glow of eyes watching from the shadows, waiting for their next victim. The full moon hung over Willow Grove Cemetery like a pale, watchful eye as Marcus began to dig. The scrape of the shovel against the hard ground echoed in the silent night, making him shiver involuntarily. After 3 months as a gravedigger, he still wasn't used to the oppressive atmosphere of the place, especially during night shifts. The grave Marcus was digging was different from the others. There was no headstone, just a small, rusty metal plaque with a number engraved, 237. His supervisor, Mr. Graves, had given him specific instructions to exhume this particular body, though he hadn't explained why. As the pit grew deeper, Marcus felt the air getting colder, denser. It was as if the earth itself was resisting his efforts, reluctant to reveal its secrets. Sweat trickled down his face despite the cold, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Finally, after what felt like hours, his shovel hit something solid. Marcus knelt, clearing the dirt with trembling hands. His fingers touched rotten wood, and he realized he had found the coffin. With a creaking sound, the coffin lid gave way under his touch. Marcus lit his lantern, pointing the beam inside. What he saw made his heart stop. There, amidst the decomposed remains of the coffin, lay a skeleton. But it wasn't the sight of the bones that made Marcus recoil in shock. It was what covered the skeleton, a wedding dress, once white and immaculate, now yellowed and stained with time but still recognizable. The skull's empty eye sockets seemed to stare at him, and for a dreadful moment, Marcus swore he saw a red glow pulsing in the depths of those hollow eyes. The wedding dress moved gently, as if the deceased was breathing. With trembling fingers, Marcus touched the fabric. It was real, tangible, but it emanated a supernatural cold that made his skin tingle. As he examined the dress, something fell from the decaying fabric, a small gold locket. Marcus picked it up, wiping away the dirt. On the back there was an inscription. "To my beloved Elizabeth, may our love last forever. 1873. A sudden sound made Marcus jump. For a moment he could have sworn he heard a sigh coming from the skeleton, a sound of deep sadness and longing. But when he looked again, everything was still. Swallowing hard, Marcus began the process of removing the body. But every time he touched the bones or the dress, he felt a wave of cold run through his body. And all the while, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. When he finally finished removing the skeleton, Marcus placed it in a body bag, as instructed. But before he zipped it up, he hesitated. There was something deeply wrong about separating the bride from her grave. Then he heard it, a whisper, so low he initially thought it was just the wind. "Please, don't take me." Marcus turned abruptly, his lantern frantically illuminating the cemetery. There was no one in sight, but the shadows between the tombstones seemed deeper, more alive. With his heart pounding in his chest, he quickly zipped up the bag and began to pull it out of the pit. But with each step, it felt as if the bag was getting heavier, as if something was resisting. When he finally emerged from the grave, Marcus was panting and trembling. He looked once more at the open pit and froze. There, at the bottom of the grave where the coffin had been, was a pool of dark liquid. And as he watched, horrified, the liquid began to move, forming words. "You shouldn't have done this." Marcus let out a strangled cry and started dragging the bag towards his cart, determined to finish the job and flee from that cursed place. But as he moved away, he couldn't help but glance over his shoulder. For an instant, he swore he saw a figure in white, standing at the edge of the grave, her veil fluttering in a non-existent breeze. But when he blinked, she was gone. Marcus quickened his pace, fighting the urge to drop everything and run. He knew he had disturbed something that should have remained buried, and as he dragged the bride's body away from her resting place, he couldn't shake the terrible certainty that this was only the beginning of his nightmare. Mr. Graves's office was shrouded in shadows when Marcus entered, the bag containing the bride's skeleton dragged behind him. The air was heavy with the smell of mold and something else, something Marcus couldn't identify but that made his stomach churn. "Ah, you found her," Mr. Graves said, his voice strangely cheerful for someone dealing with mortal remains. He rose from his chair, his eyes gleaming in a way that made Marcus shudder. "Yes, sir," Marcus replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "But there's something strange about this body. The wedding dress, the locket." Mr. Graves interrupted him with a sharp gesture. "It's none of your business, boy. Your task now is to rebury the body." Marcus frowned. "Rebury? But I thought we were going to notify the authorities or try to identify—" "No!" Mr. Graves shouted, his sudden outburst making Marcus recoil. The supervisor quickly composed himself, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I mean, there's no need. I have specific instructions for this case." He handed Marcus a map of the cemetery, a red X marking a spot in the oldest, most abandoned section. "You will bury her here tonight, alone, and you are not to mention this to anyone, understood?" Distrust grew in Marcus's chest, mixed with a fear he couldn't explain. "But sir, this doesn't seem right. Maybe we should—" Again, Mr. Graves interrupted him, this time grabbing his arm with surprising strength. His eyes, when they met Marcus's, seemed almost black in the dim light. "You will do exactly as I say, Mr. Thompson," he hissed, his breath hot and foul on Marcus's face. "Or I can ensure that your job here will be the least of your worries." Marcus swallowed hard, nodding silently. Mr. Graves released him, his fake smile back in place. "Good, now go, and remember, not a word of this to anyone." With trembling legs, Marcus dragged the bag out of the office. The cemetery seemed even darker now, the shadows deeper, more threatening. As he followed the map to the marked spot, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The burial site was a clearing surrounded by ancient trees, their gnarled branches like skeletal fingers against the night sky. Marcus began to dig, each movement of the shovel seeming to echo supernaturally in the silent night. It was when the pit was halfway done that he heard it, a whisper so low he initially thought it was just the wind in the leaves. "Please, let me go home." Marcus turned abruptly, his shovel raised defensively. There was no one in sight, but the shadows between the trees seemed to move, contorting in impossible ways. With his heart pounding, he resumed digging, faster now, desperate to finish the task and escape that place. But the whispers continued, growing louder, more insistent. "You don't understand. He won't let me rest. He's coming. He always comes." When the grave was finally deep enough, Marcus dragged the bag into it, his hands shaking so much he could barely hold the shovel. That's when he noticed. The bag's zipper was partially open. With growing dread, Marcus leaned in to close it. But before he could touch the zipper, A skeletal hand shot out from inside the bag, gripping his wrist with a cold, supernatural strength. Marcus screamed, stumbling back and falling at the edge of the pit. The bag opened completely, and the bride's skeleton rose, her tattered dress billowing in a non-existent breeze. The empty eye sockets of the skull fixed on Marcus, and a voice, ancient and full of pain, echoed in the night. "You shouldn't have brought me back. Now he knows where I am." Before Marcus could react, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the clearing. A dark figure emerged from the trees, its form indistinct in the shadows, but its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. The bride's skeleton let out a scream of pure terror, a sound that made Marcus's bones tremble. And as the dark figure advanced, Marcus did the only thing he could. He ran, leaving behind the open grave and the horrors he had unearthed. But even as he fled through the cemetery, the echo of that scream pursued him, along with the dreadful certainty that by following Mr. Graves' orders, he had unleashed something that should have remained buried forever. The following weeks were an endless nightmare for Marcus. During the day, he forced himself to perform his routine tasks at the cemetery, always looking over his shoulder, always expecting to see that dark figure emerging from the trees. At night, his dreams were haunted by visions of the bride's skeleton, her screams echoing in his mind long after he woke up. Mr. Graves acted as if nothing had happened, but Marcus couldn't help noticing the gleam of malignant satisfaction in his supervisor's eyes whenever their gazes met. Whatever had been released that night, Mr. Graves seemed to have been waiting for it for a long time. It was on a particularly dark night, about a month after the incident, that Marcus saw her for the first time. He was closing the cemetery gates when a movement caught his attention. There, among the tombstones, was a figure dressed in white. Marcus's heart stopped. The figure was of a woman, her tattered wedding dress fluttering in a non-existent breeze. Her face was hidden by a veil, but Marcus could hear muffled sobs coming from her. "Hello?" he called out, his voice trembling. "You shouldn't be here. The cemetery is closing." The figure slowly turned to him. The veil lifted on its own, revealing not a face, but a skull, the same empty eyes that had haunted his nightmares for weeks. "You brought me back," the ghost bride's voice echoed, a mixture of accusation and plea. "Now he won't let me rest." Marcus stepped back, his body trembling uncontrollably. Who won't let you rest?" A chilling wind blew through the cemetery, and the bride's voice became a terrified scream. "He's coming! He always comes!" The shadowy figure Marcus had seen on that fateful night emerged from the shadows behind the ghost bride. His face was obscured by darkness, but his eyes gleamed with supernatural malice. The ghost bride let out another scream of terror and vanished in an explosion of mist, leaving Marcus alone with the shadowy figure. The latter advanced slowly towards him, each step making the ground tremble. Marcus finally found the strength to move. He ran, barely managing to lock the gates behind him, before fleeing to the relative safety of his car. In the days that followed, the apparitions became more frequent. The ghost bride could be seen wandering the cemetery at any hour, her cries echoing in the night. Visitors began to complain of strange sensations, of objects moving on their own, of whispers coming from empty graves. Marcus tried to ignore it, tried to convince himself it was just his imagination. But he couldn't deny the supernatural cold that descended on the cemetery whenever the bride appeared, nor the terror he felt every time he glimpsed the shadowy figure lurking in the shadows. One night, while on his rounds, Marcus found the ghost bride kneeling before an old tombstone. She looked up as he approached, her empty eye sockets somehow conveying a deep, ancient sadness. "Why did you bring me back?" she asked, her voice a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "I was at peace. Now he's found me again." Marcus felt a lump in his throat. "Who is he? Why is he chasing you?" The ghost bride stood, her dress stained with earth and decay. "He is my husband, my murderer, my eternal torment." Before Marcus could respond, a furious roar echoed through the cemetery. The shadowy figure emerged from the trees, his eyes now burning with infernal fire. "She is mine!" the voice thundered, making the very air vibrate. "You cannot protect her." The ghost bride let out a scream of despair and vanished, leaving behind only the echo of her lament. The shadowy figure advanced towards Marcus, his form expanding until it seemed to swallow the entire night sky. At that moment, Marcus knew he could no longer deny the reality of what was happening. Willow Grove Cemetery had become a battleground for forces beyond his comprehension, and he was caught in the middle of it all. With a heavy heart and fear gnawing at his soul, Marcus made a decision. He could no longer stay there. No matter how much he loved his job or needed the money, some things were more important than a job. The next morning, with trembling hands and deep circles under his eyes, Marcus walked into Mr. Graves's office to hand in his resignation letter. But as he faced his supervisor's enigmatic smile, he couldn't shake the feeling that, somehow, this was exactly what Mr. Graves had wanted all along. And as he left the cemetery for the last time, Marcus couldn't help but look back. There, among the tombstones, he saw the ghost bride watching him leave, her veil gently swaying, and behind her, in the deepest shadows, 2 burning eyes watched him, silently promising that although Marcus might leave Willow Grove, the horrors he had unearthed would never truly leave him in peace. The wind howled through the twisted branches of the ancient trees surrounding Oakwood Cemetery, their leaves whispering dark secrets in the night. Jack, the solitary night shift gravedigger, walked among the worn tombstones, his lantern casting dancing shadows on the cold stone surfaces. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and decay, a constant reminder of life's finitude. For months, Jack had noticed small changes in the cemetery during his nightly rounds. At first, they were just subtle details: a fresh flower on a long-forgotten grave, footprints in the mud that weren't there the night before, the faint aroma of incense hanging in the air. He tried to rationalize, telling himself it was just dedicated relatives visiting their loved ones after hours. But something in the back of his mind alerted him that there was something more sinister at play. That particular night, the full moon hung in the sky like a vigilant eye, bathing the cemetery in an ethereal silver light. Jack felt a shiver run down his spine as he approached the oldest section of the cemetery. The tombstones here were ancient and worn, many tilted at precarious angles, like rotten teeth in a decaying mouth. It was then that he saw it, a solitary figure, dressed entirely in black, standing motionless before a moss-covered grave. Jack's heart raced, and he felt his throat tighten. In all his years working at the cemetery, he had never encountered a visitor so late at night. With hesitant steps, Jack approached, his hand trembling slightly as he held the lantern. "Excuse me, sir," he called out, his voice breaking the sepulchral silence. "The cemetery is closed at this hour." The figure did not move, gave no indication of having heard Jack. As he got closer, Jack noticed something strange about the visitor. The moonlight seemed to pass through him, as if he were made of shadows and mist. "Sir," Jack called again, now just a few feet away. Slowly, the figure turned. Jack stifled a scream. Where there should have been a face, there was only darkness, 2 cold points of light shining where eyes should be. The air around the figure rippled, like heat on asphalt on a hot summer day. Before Jack could react, the figure dissolved into the air, leaving behind only a cold whisper that seemed to echo in Jack's soul. "I promise to protect." Trembling uncontrollably, Jack stepped back, nearly tripping over a tombstone. His heart beat like a drum in his chest, and he could feel cold sweat running down his back. What he had just witnessed defied all logic and reason. In the days that followed, Jack couldn't get the encounter out of his mind. He found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, expecting to see the shadowy figure at any moment. The cemetery, once a place of peace and contemplation for him, now seemed charged with a sinister energy. Determined to find answers, Jack began to sift through the old cemetery records, kept in a dusty room at the back of the office. He spent hours after his shift, leafing through yellowed record books and fragile documents, looking for any clues about the mysterious visitor's identity. It was in a particularly old book that Jack found something intriguing. An entry dated over a century ago mentioned a man named Ezra Blackwood, a wealthy benefactor who had donated a large sum of money for the expansion and maintenance of the cemetery. The record mentioned that Ezra had made a solemn vow on his deathbed, promising that his spirit would continue to watch over and protect the cemetery for all eternity. A chill ran down Jack's spine as he read these words. Could it be that the nocturnal visitor was the spirit of Ezra Blackwood, still fulfilling his promise a century later? As Jack continued his investigation, strange events began to intensify in the cemetery. Tombstones that were intact during the day appeared cracked by morning. The sound of footsteps and whispers echoed through the empty halls of the central mausoleum. Visitors reported feeling an oppressive presence, as if they were being watched by invisible eyes. Jack knew he had awakened something by witnessing the nocturnal visitor. The dark unease that now hung over the cemetery was palpable, like a storm about to break. He found himself caught between the fear of the unknown and the responsibility to protect the place he had sworn to care for. As the moon grew again in the night sky, Jack knew it was only a matter of time before he encountered the visitor once more. And when that moment came, he would have to face not only the restless spirit of Ezra Blackwood, but also the dark secrets buried deep within Oakwood Cemetery. The nights at Oakwood Cemetery were becoming increasingly oppressive. Jack felt the weight of the air around him, as if the very atmosphere was laden with dark secrets and unfulfilled promises. He wandered the winding paths between the tombstones, his eyes constantly scanning the shadows for any movement. On a particularly dark night, when heavy clouds obscured the moon, Jack heard a sound that made his blood run cold. It was a low, prolonged moan coming from the direction of the central mausoleum. His first instinct was to flee, but something inside him urged him to investigate. With hesitant steps, Jack approached the imposing stone building. The gargoyles that adorned the roof seemed to watch him with empty eyes, judging his courage. When he reached the entrance, he noticed the heavy iron door was ajar, creaking softly in the wind. Jack swallowed hard, mustering all his courage before pushing the door open. The interior of the mausoleum was shrouded in darkness, except for a faint greenish glow emanating from the back of the main chamber. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he could discern rows of tombstones and statues, their distorted forms casting grotesque shadows on the walls. The moan sounded again, louder this time, echoing off the stone walls. Jack advanced slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. As he approached the source of the greenish light, he began to make out a figure hunched over an ornate tomb. "Ezra Blackwood?" Jack called out, his voice trembling slightly. The figure straightened abruptly, turning to face Jack. It was the same nocturnal visitor he had encountered before, but now his form seemed more solid, more present. The eyes, once just cold points of light, now burned with a feverish intensity. "You shouldn't be here," the specter's voice reverberated, not so much a sound as a sensation Jack felt in his bones. "This place is no longer safe." Jack took a step forward, determined to get answers. "What do you mean? What's happening in this cemetery?" Ezra Blackwood's spirit seemed to hesitate, his form rippling like smoke in the wind. "I vowed to protect this place, but something is awakening. Something that should remain buried." Before Jack could ask more questions, a tremor shook the ground of the mausoleum. Small stones and dust fell from the ceiling, and the air grew suddenly cold. Ezra's spirit looked around alarmed. "He's coming! You need to leave now!" Jack felt an invisible pull on his arm, dragging him towards the exit of the mausoleum. As he was pulled, he glimpsed something that made his heart nearly stop. At the back of the chamber, one of the oldest tombstones began to crack, a pulsating red light emanating from the fissures. Stumbling out of the mausoleum, Jack fell to his knees on the wet grass. Behind him, the iron door slammed shut with force, sealing the entrance. The ensuing silence was deafening, broken only by Jack's ragged breathing. In the days that followed, Jack could hardly sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the image of the cracked tombstone, the red light pulsating like an evil heart. He knew something terrible was about to happen, something that even Ezra Blackwood's protective spirit could not contain. The anomalies in the cemetery intensified. Flowers withered instantly when placed on graves. Visitors reported hearing whispers and malicious laughter echoing among the tombstones. At night, strange lights danced over the oldest graves, like will-o'-the-wisps leading the unwary to perdition. Jack found himself diving deeper into his investigation, desperate to discover what was awakening in Oakwood Cemetery. He scoured municipal archives, consulted local historians, and even risked contacting a well-known medium in the region. It was through this medium, an elderly woman named Madame Lenora, that Jack obtained his first concrete clue. According to her, the cemetery had been built on a site of great supernatural power, a nexus between the world of the living and the dead. "There's something ancient buried there," Madame Lenora warned, her cloudy eyes fixed on a point beyond Jack. "Something that feeds on the fear and suffering of the living. And now, after centuries of dormancy, it's hungry." The medium's words haunted Jack as he returned to the cemetery for his night shift. The air seemed heavier than ever, charged with a static electricity that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. As he walked among the tombstones, Jack noticed something strange. The inscriptions on the oldest stones seemed to be changing, the letters contorting and reorganizing before his eyes. Familiar names were replaced by strange symbols and words in a language he did not recognize. A high-pitched scream cut through the air, making Jack turn sharply. On the horizon, beyond the cemetery walls, he saw the lights of the small town beginning to flicker and go out, as if a wave of darkness was spreading from Oakwood Cemetery. Jack's heart raced as he realized the terrible truth. Whatever was awakening in the cemetery was no longer contained. The barrier between worlds was unraveling, and the forces Ezra Blackwood had sworn to contain were about to be unleashed upon the world of the living. With trembling steps, Jack made his way to the central mausoleum, knowing that was where it had all begun, and, likely, where it would all end. The night around him seemed alive, shadows moving with a will of their own, and whispers echoing in the wind. As he approached the mausoleum entrance, Jack saw the familiar figure of Ezra Blackwood materialize before him. The spirit seemed weaker, almost transparent. "You shouldn't have come back," Ezra said, his voice heavy with regret. "Now there's no way to stop it." "Stop it?" Jack asked, feeling the fear grow in his chest. "What's waking up?" Ezra opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, a deafening roar echoed from the depths of the mausoleum. The ground shook violently, and Jack watched in horror as the building's doors opened by themselves, revealing a pulsating darkness that seemed to swallow all light. Jack felt paralyzed, watching as the darkness extended from the mausoleum like shadowy tentacles. The air grew thick, laden with a putrid smell that turned his stomach. Ezra, the protective spirit, seemed to be dissolving, his ethereal form being absorbed by the growing darkness. "I failed," Ezra whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar emanating from the mausoleum. "The Devourer. It's free." Before Jack could react, an invisible force dragged him into the mausoleum. He struggled, his nails scraping the stone floor as he was pulled into the darkness. The interior of the building was no longer recognizable. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, covered in black veins that glowed with a sickly red light. In the center of the chamber, where the ancient tomb had once been, now opened a vortex of darkness. From its depths, Jack saw a figure emerge that defied comprehension. It was an amorphous mass of shadows and rotting flesh, with multiple eyes glowing with a primordial hunger. "Finally!" The Devourer's voice reverberated, not just in Jack's ears but in his mind. "After centuries of confinement, I am free to feast again." Jack tried to scream, but no sound came from his throat. He felt as if his very essence was being drained, consumed by the creature's presence. Memories of his entire life flashed before his eyes, being devoured one by the Devourer. With superhuman effort, Jack managed to crawl backward, away from the creature. His gaze fell on an ancient symbol carved into the floor, partially covered by centuries of dust. Without thinking, he wiped away the dust, revealing a complex inscription. The Devourer let out an ear-splitting shriek, momentarily recoiling. "The seal!" The creature roared, "Destroy it!" In that instant, Jack understood. The symbol was part of an ancient containment spell, the last line of defense against the creature. With trembling hands, he began to trace the lines of the symbol, feeling a strange energy flow through him. Tendrils of darkness lashed out at him, tearing his flesh and threatening to drag him into the vortex. Jack screamed in pain but didn't stop. He could feel Ezra's presence beside him, the last remnant of the protective spirit lending him strength. As he completed the symbol, a blinding light began to emanate from the floor. The devourer howled, a cacophony of agonized voices echoing throughout the cemetery. Jack felt as if his body was being torn apart, the energy of the seal flowing through him. "No!" the devourer roared, its form contorting and fragmenting. "I will not return to the abyss." The light intensified, engulfing everything around. Jack closed his eyes, feeling as if every cell in his body was on fire. The devourer's roar mixed with his own screams of agony. Then suddenly, silence. When Jack opened his eyes, he found himself lying on the cold floor of the mausoleum. The air was clean, and the oppressive sense of evil had vanished. Slowly, painfully, he got up, looking around. The mausoleum was in ruins, but the vortex was gone. Where the devourer had been, there was only a mound of black ashes. The symbol on the floor glowed faintly, its lines permanently etched into the stone. Jack staggered outside, feeling strangely empty. The cemetery was silent, the first rays of the rising sun touching the tombstones. He looked at his hands, noticing strange scars forming patterns similar to the seal's symbol. As he surveyed the cemetery, Jack realized that something fundamental had changed. Ezra's protective presence had completely vanished, sacrificed to reseal the devourer. And although the immediate threat had passed, Jack knew the scars of that night would remain forever, both on him and on Oakwood Cemetery itself. The distant sound of sirens reached his ears. The city was waking up, unaware of the horror that had almost been unleashed. Jack looked once more at his marked hands, knowing he now bore a burden no one else could understand. He was the new guardian of Oakwood Cemetery, destined to watch over the seal and ensure the devourer never broke free again. As the sun rose on the horizon, Jack walked slowly among the tombstones, accepting his new fate and the shadows that now inhabited his soul.